So what does cinematic actually mean? Well, from the Oxford Dictionary, cinematic is basically having the characteristics of a motion picture, a movie. But there are so many different ways to shoot a film, so how can you define what is cinematic? To me, the idea of cinematic is thought out and planned footage. If you just grab your camera, flip it into auto, press record, and just point it at your subject, then there's probably a good chance that you're not gonna get the best looking footage. Creating cinematic footage is not only a way to make your shots look better, but it's also a way to add some meaning into your footage, which could potentially evoke an emotional response from your viewer. For example, the goal of the opening sequence of this video was not only to show you a cinematic sequence, but also to perk your sense of taste and smell. This style of food cinematography, which is often used in commercials, makes you want to have some of the product that's being featured. So let's talk about movies for a second. So the goal of a feature film is to tell you a story. And if it's done right, then that story is gonna connect with you on a much deeper level. That's why we can watch a movie like Toy Story and really feel this deep connection with the film. The film is not about talking toys, rather it's about friendship and the fear of rejection, which resonates with all of us. So to me, cinematic at its core is a few things. A, it's having polished, professional looking footage. B, it's thinking through all the potential possibilities about what will happen when you hit record and having a reason why you made a choice. And C, creating footage that evokes an emotional response from the viewer and connects them more with your video. There are videos that are very rough and raw that feel cinematic, but often that's the creator making a choice to make it look rough and raw and shaky and all of that, because for that video or for that story, it made sense to have that style. And because it was a choice, it feels more cinematic. So I have 12 things that I've come up with that I want you to think about when you're making your choices of hitting record on your camera. Now, like I said, any of these standards are meant to be broken. There is no hard set rules, but my goal with this video is to give you an understanding of what is cinematic and how you can start using it to craft better looking videos. The first is depth of field. Cinematic footage is often said to have shallow depth of field or blurry background, which helps you really isolate your subject and create focus in your image. To get more shallow depth of field, you need to open up your aperture wider. Frame rate. Video is made of individual images rather than something that is moving. The amount of frames in a second make up your frame rate. The standard for real-time footage in cinema is 24 frames per second because it adds a certain cinematic quality to your footage and it's not completely fluid. Frame rate is also what controls slow motion. You use a high frame rate to slow down footage. Slow motion gives you that dreamy quality that's often associated with the cinematic look, especially here on YouTube. So you'll shoot in 60 or 120 frames per second and slow it down to a 24 frame per second timeline, and then that will give you your buttery super slow motion. Shutter speed is basically how long your sensor is exposed to light. The faster your shutter speed, the more that you'll freeze action. The standard for cinema is double that of your frame rate. This adds some motion blur into your image so that each frame is not super clear and crisp. Aspect ratio. In general, widescreen is associated with cinema. However, most screens are 16:9 and most cameras shoot in 16:9. And here on YouTube, a 2:1 aspect ratio often looks a little more cinematic than your standard 16:9. Gives you a little bit wider field of view. One huge tip when it comes to making your footage wider, don't add black bars on the top and bottom, rather actually edit in the aspect ratio that you're going for. The lenses that you use will have a huge effect on how your footage will look. Longer lenses tend to look more cinematic because of the effect they have on your shots. They compress your background and give you a different quality than super wide lenses. It's also harder to do things like camera movement on super long lenses. So often because of the fact that it's harder to get these styles of shots, they will look more cinematic in your edit. Color grading will have a major impact on the feeling of your footage. You can create an entirely new emotional quality to your footage by just editing the colors in your shots. Understanding color theory is going to create balance and harmony within your footage between shot to shot and scene to scene. But when you add something different into your footage, a color that stands out, say like a yellow jacket in a green forest, then that's gonna draw attention to that thing in your shot and create more of a focal point for the viewer. How does your camera move in space and how stable is your shot? Typically slow methodical movements, kind of like this jib I have over here, and the slider I have over here will give your footage more of that cinematic quality. There's so many tools available on the market now to be able to move your camera in these slow methodical ways, like gimbals and jibs and sliders, and all of these tools will help you get more cinematic looking footage. Now you could definitely use handheld looking footage. However, you need to really think about the reason why you're making something handheld. If you're doing it just because you're lazy and you don't want to set up your entire camera setup, then it's not going to necessarily work. Whereas when you use handheld footage for a purpose and it helps enhance the scene or the feeling that you're trying to get out of the footage, then that's when you get the cinematic quality to handheld looking footage. And oftentimes just using a tripod will make your footage more cinematic than if you were just hand holding the camera. Perspective and composition. Changing where your camera is shooting will completely change how a scene will feel. The common issue for new creators is to hold your camera like this, at eye level, shooting your subject dead center. And the issue is when you do this, all your footage looks the same. You want to get different perspectives. You want to shoot up high, you want to go down low. Composition refers to the way that everything is arranged within your frame. For cinematic looking footage, the focal point or the subject is often not dead center. The creator will put them in one of the thirds because it's more pleasing for the viewer to watch. Symmetry and balance are also things that you need to consider when you're framing up a shot. Probably one of the most important elements to getting cinematic footage is lighting. Whether you're adding lights into a scene or you're shooting somewhere outside, the position of your subject in relation to where the light source is will really dictate how an image will look. Also, the quantity of light, the quality of light, and the color of light. Everything plays together to give you something that looks cinematic versus something that looks super flat and boring. So the next few things don't deal with actually shooting, however, they are super important to creating that cinematic look. Editing choices. The way that you edit your footage together will have a huge impact on the way that the footage feels. So if you cut it really fast and put a ton of edits in there, it's gonna feel more intense and it's gonna bring up the energy. Whereas if you cut slower and you let things breathe a little bit, it's gonna add a little bit more stillness into the footage that you're shooting. Also, making decisions on what to keep and what to remove is gonna make your end product more cinematic or less cinematic. Often one of the most underutilized aspects is sound effects. You could create a whole world of sound that feels real, but it's completely made up of sounds recorded elsewhere. So building out your sound design to fit your story and to create more of that emotional impact is gonna make your footage look more cinematic. Music is a major component to give emotional depth to your footage. Does the sequence that you're trying to create need something happy and poppy, or does it need something more somber? These are choices that you make that's gonna have an impact on all the footage that you're shooting. To me, cinematic is a combination of all of these different options. So when you're watching footage that you think has this cinematic quality, think through what are the choices that the creator made in putting the sequence together, and reverse engineering someone else's work is going to help you figure out what you can do in your footage to make it more cinematic. So take a look at this video right here. It's a deep dive into what is cinematic B-roll, and I also go through some tips on how you could start shooting some better footage.